We might start with rugby. There's all the Champions Cup reports, obviously, as people might imagine, but it's David Walsh's piece on the back page of the Sunday Times which caught your eye, my eye, everyone's eye, really. It's not one that you'll read lightly and forget about, especially if your kids playing rugby. Yeah,
it's quite frightening, and I think probably the main thrust of it is he's talking about the increase in physicality and intensity and speed and strength and violence in rugby, and he focuses on the recent tragic death of the Stade de France player Chauvin, I think is how we call him, or Nicolas Chauvin. And there's a line here that just jumped out at me. It's actually quite scary. This poor young guy he died after a tackle, and David Walsh says Chauvin's death was not a once-in-a-decade accident, far from it. 4 months ago, a 21-year-old died after a pre-season friendly. And he goes on to kind of detail the other tragic incidences in rugby games or after rugby games, after tackles, that have happened in the last few months. So it's just quite frightening.
Yeah, he charts almost his day yesterday going to a Premier League game and then coming home and watching Leinster Bath back recorded, and he's talking about the collisions we see. He says more and more though it's becoming a guilty pleasure. And Nicolas Chauvin, he was playing against Bordeaux for Stade Francais. He suffered a broken neck which led to a cardiac arrest, which is just a dreadful way for anyone to pass, and he was 19 years of age. And the former Stade scrum half, Jérôme Fiol, expressed a lament. He said, "Too much violence, too many blows, too much trauma, too much shock. Let us return to the basics of this sport where it is unbearable to think that you can leave life on the field." And as you said, Marie, Walsh goes through a number of other deaths. Louis Frajowski, who died in a pre-season friendly in a second-tier French game. He was a France under-20 international. He lost consciousness, recovered, and then in the dressing room he started vomiting, and emergency services arrived, but he died in the changing room. And one of their former players said, "We're going towards more speed, intensity, violence, more and more difficult contacts, and they need to be avoided." And interestingly, the French sports minister has sat down with Bernard Laporte to talk about the issue of safety in rugby. They met last month. I hadn't realised that had happened. So that's where we are.
The second most interesting strand in the piece, Joe, I think, is David Walsh is successfully arguing that the game itself is in denial about the impacts of this massively increased physicality, and pieces all the stronger for the factual basis on which he puts the argument out there. We're all familiar with Dr. Barry O'Driscoll and his outspokenness on the subject. I hadn't been familiar with the research project undertaken by Patria Hume at the University of Auckland Technology, where she argued very effectively and very strongly that proportionately more rugby players have had worse brain health scores when they were analysed. And she included in her report a pretty strongly worded statement saying that to better address the implications for player neurocognitive health, we believe players should be aware of the potential increased long-term risk of cognitive impairment from concussion, so that they can make informed choices about engagement in sport. And the most interesting aspect of that is that the paragraph was deleted when the official press release was put out by New Zealand Rugby and World Rugby.
Yeah, I thought that was extraordinary. So, like, I mean, you boil that down. New Zealand Rugby commissioned Auckland University to do this study. The study finds that actually it is affecting your cognitive abilities if you play rugby. And then, as Hume half expected, he says, she's one of the doctors behind the study, the New Zealand Union, who commissioned the study, deleted that paragraph from her press release.
Yeah. No, the whole thing speaks to, I mean, Marie, who's quite a bit younger than me, was asking me if any of my children, when we were chatting outside, had played rugby. And I do have a son, Jack, who played underage rugby for UL Bohemians for probably 7 or 8 years. Really enjoyed it from the age of about 8 up until maybe 15. Fantastic team building, great memories, friendships, great sport. But towards the end of that period, I noticed that the game was becoming increasingly about power, about physicality, and that the children who were being sort of chosen for the teams were the bigger kids. And I often wondered at that time whether any of the kids who were associated with Jack's team would ever make it in the game. And interestingly enough, one of them, prop forward, did. You know, he got on very, very well. He got picked for Munster under-18s, Munster under-20s, Ireland under-20s. And earlier this year, he was cut loose from the Munster Academy in the first year, about 2 months after a 118 kg 18-year-old prop was imported from South Africa. And I think the feeling would have been that Jack's pal wouldn't have been sort of big enough. So let's find somebody who is big enough to withstand the game. So one kid who has been reared in Irish rugby all his life has dreams of making it as a professional, is deemed, I think, not to be big enough. So let's bring in a bigger beast from outside the country. And that's just the way the game has gone now.
Yeah.
And I think it's time to look seriously at the impact of power, because as David's piece sets out, you know, I spoke to Paul O'Connell, I happened to be speaking to him on Monday. He was very, very upset being working for Stad now.
Yeah, where that 18-year-old died, yeah.
It definitely, I think, raises the question of what's it going to take? Like, it obviously, when there's young people and they pass away, it often doesn't kind of filter into the mainstream. Like it tends to be, you know, a big name, a big story, a big player, like when something serious happens to them. I have kids as well who play rugby, and I'm almost embarrassed sometimes telling people that they play rugby. It's like I'm being a bad parent, or that people are going to judge me because I'm letting them play rugby. Now they're only 4 and 6 and they play down in Terranure and they love it and it's great and they're just running around playing.
The hits aren't quite as big at 4 and 6.
No, they're just, I think the 6-year-old might be learning how to tackle now, like that's about it. But I now look at these injuries and these tragic stories with, I suppose, kind of thinking of my own children with that in mind. And I remember back in September looking at Cornell Dupree, the Scottish back row, suffered this horrendous injury where he fractured the cartilage below his Adam's apple and he damaged his voice box, and he was in hospital for 4 weeks and he couldn't speak. And I thought, God, this must be like the rarest thing ever to happen. So obviously I Googled it, and you know, I found out that these, you know, people can injure their larynx like quite regularly in rugby. So I just thought like the force that people are being hit with must be phenomenal. And you know, that all comes into my mind when I'm reading these and when I'm thinking about it. And you know, I wonder what will the effect be on participation in time.
But that's the really interesting question. So there's a few different strands. There's where rugby goes at the professional level, where it's bigger and stronger and faster, and will they have to change the rules of the game just to make that sustainable almost for the players? And then there is what it does to participation, because mothers and fathers all over the country will read a story like that and will think to themselves, well, is it worth it? You know, does rugby give things that many other team sports also give? And the answer is no. There's nothing unique beyond the rules. I mean, it's team environment. It's going to keep you fit and strong and give you discipline, and friendships, all the things that we celebrate.
Yeah, it does all of those things quite wonderfully.
Apply to a soccer team or GA team or anything.
The other side of that, Joe, is that some kids just really like rugby and they want to play it.
Sure.
And their heroes are Jordan Larmour and Brian Driscoll, and that's the route that...
The other thing is it's never been more popular in the country, ironically, and you have a story like that, a big story like that. It's never been more popular.
But I think the game, even in the last 3 years, it's just happening so quickly that the physicality, it's almost like a different game to the one. It's certainly a completely different game to the one that the amateur players played back in the 90s and the 80s. But I would even say from 5 years ago, it's almost a different game again now. It's just, and it's gone too far, I think. It's just...
difficult to row back on now, though, isn't it?
Yeah, and as David points out in the piece, you know, nobody has come up with a solution to how do you stop this runaway train, you know? How do you stop a situation whereby, you know, people's work in the gym seems to be...
And skills of strength and conditioning coaches and programs. And
then you have scenarios where we see in South Africa, you have this under-18 tournament that has recently produced 6 positive tests for anabolic steroids. And, you know, it's being increasingly seen by parents over there. There have been reports to verify this, that parents and coaches are sort of more or less turning a blind eye to it because it's seen as a way out. It's seen as a means of getting a big money contract or a decent money contract.
Yeah.
And we're buying into that. We're certainly importing plenty of players from South Africa, young players. Who knows, what the history of them has been. We know we've seen one or two examples of players coming in who have tested positive
and leaving again.
and leaving again quite quickly.
Well, they wouldn't have left if there wasn't a media furore, is the truth.
True, yeah. The media.
That is the practical
truth.
truth.
The media storm took 12 months to erupt, though, didn't it?
And
Did you? I think Grobler signed during a Lions tour.
Yeah, and then was
quiet.
injured for a
yeah,
sustained
and then when he
period,
started to play, and then when he left, he did say.
But
that
there've been
it
plenty of others signed since then, and we don't know really. I mean, coming from that culture.
Let's not name names
One
here.
would have to be. We won't know, but one would have to be, somewhat careful.
Well, certainly it seems South Africa don't have their house in order, and there is a culture if teenagers are doing it, and there's adverse findings at the local talent get-together at that age. And as someone said at the time, I remember Martin Ziegler was writing about it, there was a quote from somebody saying, I mean, these are just those that we've caught. You know, you have to be really pretty stupid to get caught in some respects.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So, I don't know, because, well, as Walsh says, I mean, how do you row back? They've lowered the tackle height, that's fine, but I mean, a lot of the worst injuries come from knees hitting off heads, low tackles. They're not going to get slower. They're only going to get faster. They're probably going to get bigger, stronger, more explosive, certainly.
Yeah.
So there can't ever be a time where you say rugby isn't a physical game. Like, that is the game.
Yeah, that is the game, but there are degrees of physicality, and I think we have now surpassed an acceptable level. And even from a spectator point of view, I mean, you see some of these games are just absolute arm wrestles, slugfests, brutally demanding physical contests. They're enjoyable on one level, but I think the French rugby that we all remember with fondness was the flair game.
Running into space as opposed to running at the man.
Yeah, exactly.
back to basics, they say here, isn't it?
Yeah, okay, well, it's a terrible week. I mean, the publicity for rugby has been bad because there was a minute's silence held for this player before every Champions Cup game all weekend. So the whole rugby fraternity across Europe has watched the minute's silence and seen a 19-year-old's picture up on the screens around stadiums. So.
Yeah.
Does it get into the public sphere, though?
Don't know.
Does it resonate with people that might not be as interested in?
Well, the fear is that there's a minute's silence and then nothing. You know.
I don't think any parent could read this article lightly.
No.
Yeah.
I think there will be some difficult conversations around brunch this morning in certain households.
Like we might send back the tackle bag that Santa was going to bring.
Well, I mean, I don't want you to feel like a neglectful parent, and I'm sure I'm sure it'll be fine. But there will be. I think something like this does permeate through, and people will talk. And
and like everything in sport, it all comes back to a need to win. You know, that's what it's all about, really. You know,
Sure.